The ink ring on the footnote was still damp when I lifted the folio. Suspicion tightened my hands around the vellum, and I did not let go. The circle around the tiny numeral was made in a darker iron gore than the surrounding script. My right index finger, stained faintly with old ink, pressed the margin as if it could stop the wetness from spreading. "Isabel," I said, because the reading room was meant to be empty at this hour. A tall woman moved at the far table, coming closer on measured steps. She set a strap of keys on the desk before she spoke. "You shouldn't be handling that one unsupervised, Elias, Isabel Roth." Her voice held a practiced irritation. My suspicion moved into a clearer thought. Someone had altered the folio to draw my attention. The folio lay open to a 17th century commentary. The circled footnote pointed to a shelf mark that had been partially erased and rewritten. I traced the rubbed numbers with the pad of my thumb. That erasure did not match the rest of the marginal wear. The catalogue ink was older. This correction was newer, fresher. The problem was concrete. A footnote wasn't just a typo here, it rewrote provenance. I set the folio down slowly. "Who circled this?" I asked. "Handling it like that risks the folio," Isabel answered. But she did not close the book. She folded a hand over the corner, watching the circled numeral. "Provenance says donor chest G, accession 57. You know our policy. Policy isn't an answer," I said. I felt the first small shift in me. Suspicion became itch, then pressure to act. My lamp cast a narrow cone. The rest of the reading room was a low shelf of desks and the hush of other scholars' lamps. I had been awarded fellowship to study marginalia patterns. Those patterns were supposed to be a map, not a set of traps. Isabel tapped the keys, ledgers restricted. "You know why? The exchange forced the scene into a problem I could name, altered footnotes that redirected future readers. If marginalia were being changed, then the Institute's records could be steered. I had to know how many entries had been manipulated and who had access to the restoration chain. I packed the folio into its cradle and did not move to leave. My chest felt a pressure. Suspicion shifted into resolve. I set my spectacles on the table and rubbed the bridge of my nose. "I will request the provenance ledger tomorrow," I said. Isabel's eyes narrowed. "You will be denied." She left the keys and the book and walked away. Her footsteps traced a thin rhythm across the stone. I watched her go and felt the second emotional change, from resolve to the small tremor of dread. That dread made me pause, check the reading room door, and then copy the circled numeral with a pencil into my Moleskine. Within the first hours of morning, my formal request ran into procedural walls. Mr. Hargrove, the cataloger, read the request without looking up from his ledger. "Chain of custody intact," he said twice. He slid a stamped denial across the desk. He used the phrase as if repeating it could make it true. "Show me the acquisition entry for accession 57, I said. "Not without supervision, Med." Hargrove replied. His hand hovered near a drawer. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. I saw a quick tightening at the back of his jaw, and I heard the click of the drawer when he pushed it shut. His evasiveness pushed suspicion into frustration. I left with a stamped refusal and the feel of a door closed without explanation. That evening, Anna Kovac intercepted me in the fellowship common room. She thrust a torn slip of paper into my hand, found it inside a donated volume destined for cataloging, she said. Anna kept her voice low but direct. She had a quick, deliberate manner. Her sentences arrived like pebbles dropped to test a still pool. I unfolded the scrap. The ink formed a tiny sigil in the margin and a partial accession number, the same circle, I said. Anna tapped the table. "I thought you should see it." I left work early to avoid questions. We compared 3 folios at the microfilm reader that night. Each bore the same marginal sigil and the same pattern of corrections. A smudge here, an overwritten shelf mark there, short pencil retouches in different scripts. My suspicion shifted again. It hardened into the idea of pattern. The pattern moved me from private doubt to active pursuit. We found more than scribal habit. In the conservation storeroom, I forced a cabinet open and found a box labeled with the donor chest code. Inside, someone had left a set of scientific notes on ink mixtures. The notes described an iron, gall ink recipe uncommon in our records. They mentioned a supplier in Lyon. A bruise of cold rose through me. This was not random annotation. Whoever controlled conservation could manufacture authoritative corrections. Hargrove answered my questions with overly neat sentences. We swap microfilm sometimes for preservation, he said. He did not meet my eyes. When I pressed him, his fingers tightened on a spool. He admitted that some reels had been replaced months earlier, but insisted that replacements were routine and documented. When I demanded to see the ledger entries in the stacks, his insistence hardened into refusal. That refusal pushed me to an action the ledger's custodians would not expect. Anna and I planned a trip to the off-site repository. We rented a van, collected flashlights, and left after dinner. The stakeout that followed was small and precise. We sat wedged between two shelving towers and counted footsteps instead of sleeping. At midnight, a man moved with the purposeful silence of a familiar route. He was a visiting scholar I had seen in seminars, Professor Alistair Crowe. He handled folios with the certainty of someone who believed himself entitled. We watched as he slid a folio into a canvas satchel and closed the latch. His hand paused on a ledger near the cart. He did not sprint. He moved like a man making a routine errand. Anna mouthed his name, and I felt a spike of anger. We tried to follow, but lost him in the stacks when he clustered with a group of boxes. We did not get him. We did, however, find a torn ledger fragment that bore the sigil and a catalogue code linked to a named benefactor. The fragment smelt faintly of tobacco and brass polish. I folded it into my coat and felt the papery edges bite my palm. That discovery threw a new variable into the case. A living agent, a benefactor, a methodical hand. The next dawn, I confronted him in the faculty courtyard. Crowe stood beneath the colonnade as if waiting for me. He wore a winter coat and a linen scarf despite the chill. He held a cup of coffee and spoke with even cadence. "Marlowe," he said, "you have questions." "Professor Crowe," I answered, "why did you remove that folio?" His coffee cup made a small vertical sound when he set it on the low wall. He did not look surprised. "I didn't remove your folio, Elias. I improved the record." "Improved." Anna. She had followed and stood to my left. Her cheeks were flushed from running. "You circled a footnote. You overwrote a shelf mark. Why?" Crowe's face did not change. "Because histories are written by people who can persuade others. If persuasion requires editing small errors, and that's theft of authority," I said. My voice sharpened. I felt a new emotion arrive, moral outrage unfolding into cold calculation. I quoted a line from a grant application as a weapon. "You undermine the chain of custody and call it scholarship." Crowe took a slow breath. "I guide the record, Elias. Think of it as directing a conversation. You may either join or be swept aside." Anna stepped forward. "Professor Crowe, you cannot decide what the record says for everyone, Anna," he said. With a hint of patronizing warmth, "You are young. You don't yet see the necessity of coordination." The confrontation produced rapid lines. I pushed. "Who pays for this coordination?" I asked. Crowe looked at the torn ledger fragment I held in my palm. "A benefactor," he conceded. He named the family. The name like it closed a contract. "Why them?" I asked. "Resources and discretion." Crowe replied, "Their donations support the institution. They prefer histories arranged in ways that smooth public reception. So you smooth evidence to please donors." I said, "I smooth narratives to protect longer projects." Crowe answered, "You could help. We could avoid scandal." There were 3 or 4 beats of quick argument that felt like a rope pull. Anna's voice rose and fell. I said, "You want me to lie for you." He did not deny it. Instead, he offered a bargain. Acquiesce, and Crowe would arrange quiet endorsements. Refuse, and Crowe implied professional ruin delivered in polite letters. He described the mechanisms without naming them. Grant reviews, recommendation notes inserted into dossiers, anonymous talk at conferences. He presented harm as administrative inevitability. My first reaction was to refuse. My hands were steady. My ink-stained finger found the inside of my coat pocket where I had placed the torn ledger fragment. Crowe waited for the tremor in me to become capitulation. Anna's mouth pressed into a thin line. I weighed the cost. Professional ruin meant losing access to collections, losing my fellowship, losing the trail that could expose the network. Compliance meant preserving access but letting the record be shaped by invisible hands. I felt an inward double shift. Anger to cold calculation, then calculation to a protective instinct for the documents themselves. I told Crow I would not be complicit. He smiled without warmth and said, "Then you know the consequences." He did not raise a hand. He did not need to. The courtyard seemed to record the exchange in concrete ways. A pigeon's wing beat, a student hurrying past, a way a lock clicked behind an office door. That exchange altered the game. Isabel returned a missing folio with a formal reprimand, and a letter slipped into my mailbox warning about mishandling restricted materials. Her words were polite. The subtext carried meaning. Someone high had noticed. The threat was indirect, administrative, precise. I folded the reprimand and placed it in my satchel. Anna watched me as I made copies of the ledger fragment on the microfilm reader. We made choices then. Instead of public accusation, I made clandestine transmission. I photographed the torn ledger with a hand scanner and encrypted the files before sending them by courier to a colleague in Geneva who had fewer institutional ties. I copied the iron gall recipe pages and hid the originals in a secret cache in my study, a false bottom in the brass pocket watch my father had left me. The object smelled of oil and time. I slid the fragment into the watch case and wound the mechanism until the tick covered my breath. That act changed my mood from active to guarded. We staged a small ceremonial burn. I stacked decoy annotated pages in the courtyard and set them alight while Anna watched with a rag over her mouth. The fire produced a neat ash pattern and a curl of smoke that our colleagues later described as accidental smoking in the yard. I kept the true copies hidden. Late that night, alone at my desk, I wrote a footnote of my own. It was precise and innocuous. A cross, reference carefully phrased to invite future scholars to question the accession entry for chest G accession 57. The note contained a subtle contradiction, a small breadcrumb encoded in cataloging language. I sealed the real ledger fragment in the watch case and slid the watch into a hollow between old bindings in my satchel. My emotions moved again. Suspicion had triggered investigation. Investigation had led to danger. Danger had become cautious preservation. The shifts were visible in my actions. I spaced entries in my notebook differently. I tapped the fountain pen more often. I tested the lock on my study door 3 times before bed. Those movements kept me awake with small, concrete tasks instead of brooding. A surprise came before the chapter's close. Mr. Hargrove, who had been evasive in the stacks, approached Anna in the microfilm room and offered an apology. He slid a single index card across the table with a neat, unfamiliar hand. On it was a brief note. "Not all of us are comfortable." He refused to say more, but his eyes told a different story. Tension and relief. This small reveal changed how I understood him. He was not merely a stone wall of denial. He was a person caught between compliance and conscience. The ledger fragments, catalog code linked to a named benefactor, and a set of correspondence in the university, donor files. I could not access those files without permission, but the index card suggested someone inside the system wanted change without public reckoning. That twist altered our options. It gave us an inside ally, however small, and it confirmed that the manipulation was coordinated and institutional, not the act of a single rogue scholar. Before the week ended, I arranged for a trusted colleague in Geneva to receive the encrypted photographs. I also set a mechanical lock on the box in my study where I hid originals, and I wrote a short, cautious note in an innocuous margin of a routine catalog correction so that a future reader could find the inconsistency and ask why the accession code did not match donor chest G in the ledger. I felt the chapter close coming. I burned the decoy pages, placed the sealed watch case into a false compartment of my satchel, and left a benign annotation in the public catalogue that only a scholar would notice. That small act was my version of seeding. It was not public accusation. It was not full exposure. It was an invitation disguised as ordinary scholarship. Isabel delivered her reprimand in person the next morning. "Marlowe," she said, sliding a formal note across the desk. "Do not endanger donations." I placed the burned decoy ash into an envelope and dropped it in the bin. Anna watched me fold the envelope. "Do you think we can stop them?" she asked. I put the sealed watch case into my coat pocket and felt the brass warm from my hand. "We can make it harder for them to steer the record without leaving a trace," I said. That was an action I could take, bury truth where it could be exhumed, rather than shouting it into a system designed to smooth inconvenient facts. I walked out into the courtyard with the watch heavy against my thigh. The morning wind lifted the scarf at my collar. I had refused Crow and kept copies elsewhere. I had a small ally in Mr. Hargrove and an eager collaborator in Anna. I had sent evidence to Geneva. I had burned decoys and hidden truth in the smallest, least obvious place I knew. A footnote phrase to look like friction, not accusation. I locked the study door behind me and glanced once at the ledger fragment's imprint in my moleskin. My hands stopped on the latch of the gate. The final action of the chapter was concrete and deliberate. I pressed the watch into the hollow of a stone marker in the garden and dropped a neighboring catalogue card over it to disguise the seam. I walked away without glancing back. The truth, for now, lived under brass and stone and a line of careful, ordinary catalogue language. The quarrel with the institution would continue, but the ledger fragment sat quiet in my pocket watch. And a new footnote waited in the public record for the right reader to find it. I caught Anna with a quill over the margin, the iron gall still wet. Suspicion drove my hands forward before my voice. My right index finger, stained faintly with old ink, reached for the folio and froze her movement. "Anna," I said, and the quill trembled in her hand. The locked reserve smelled of cold glue and brass, and the lamp over the table cast a hard circle on vellum. Within those first breaths, I had the problem made plain. Someone was altering footnotes on purpose, and the altered line led straight back to the damp ring I had found in that earlier folio. I shoved the memory of that first ink ring into the shape of a question to keep my head clear. The image from the earlier night, the tiny dark circle around a numeral, the same darker iron gall, had not left me. I had not planned to return after hours. I had come for photocopies, not a confrontation, but the quill in Anna's hand and the register note tucked into her sleeve made the stakes concrete. The ledger beneath the stacks, if it existed, would move the question from a single false hand to a pattern. Suspicion sat in my throat. Every decision where I let it breathe would change names, careers, and evidence. "What are you doing?" I demanded. My voice was flat. I kept my spectacles on, the round wire frames catching the lamp like a rim of metal. Anna's hands shook when she set the quill down. Her palm left a dark smudge along the folio edge. "Elias, it's not what it looks like," she said. She used my name the way people do when they want to anchor a charged moment. The immediacy of her denial did not calm the thread of doubt. I stepped closer and saw the circled numeral again, ink darker than the surrounding script. My finger touched the damp ring. The vellum left a faint oil on my skin. "You were darkening these?" I asked. Her eyes darted to the shelf, to the locked door, then to the accession slip she had slid into her palm. "Procedural emendation," she said. "Custodial committee instructions." She folded the slip into a small square and slid it across the table. "I follow orders, Elias. I don't invent things." The words landed like a stone. I felt a shift inside me, suspicion tilting toward doubt. If Anna truly believed a committee had ordered corrections, then this was institutional, not rogue. If she lied, I had an individual court red-handed. The shift mattered. I breathed through the change, counted to 3, and said, "Show me the accession note." She pushed the square over. The handwriting was neat, spare, and unsigned. It read only a series of catalogue numbers and the cryptic phrase "Custodial Committee Review Approved." No names. Anna's jaw clenched. Marco, who had been lingering in the doorway with a folded microfilm box, stepped into the light and said, "Custodial Committee." That phrasing isn't standard. His voice was low, the visiting fellow's cadence quick and querulous. Marco has a habit of moving his hands when he speaks. He set the microfilm on the table with one thumb and tapped it twice. "Show me how you did it," I told Anna. She raised the quill as if she would demonstrate. Instead, she lowered it and swallowed. "I used to be a conservator," she said. "I know how inks take to old vellum." This was a correction meant to stabilize the reading. Stabilize for whom? Marco snapped. He stepped between us, leaned over the folio, and traced the marginal sigil with a finger gloved in cotton, alias, look. The darker iron, Gaul appears in 3 separate entries across this volume. That pattern suggests a single hand or a standard applied to multiple folios. I set my brass pocket watch on the table and opened it without looking at the face. The watch S-chain clicked, a small sound in the quiet room. I thought of the earlier folio with its damp ring. Memory matters in a case like this because it lets you test repetition, I asked. Do you have copies of the accession logs? Microfilm. Anything we can compare. Anna hesitated, then reached under the table. She produced a folded microfilm index that matched Marco's box. We have matching reels for several of the Donner collections, she said. But some entries are restricted to committee review. That answer pushed suspicion into a new shape. Institutional complicity. An emotion shift nudged under the surface, doubt opening into something more like alarm. I felt my pulse in my throat. The archival rules were a shield. If donors or benefactors demanded certain readings, the archive could appear neutral while complying. I set the watch down and said, "Then we compare." Now, we worked through the early morning. Marco ran the rollers on the microfilm machine while Anna fed the reel. I sat with the folio between us, adjusting my spectacles to read marginalia I had missed before. The repeated sigil appeared again, an ink blot resembling a compass rose tucked into a margin, always near corrected numerals. Each blot had that same darker iron, gall that had stained my finger the first night. Marco's mouth went flat when he saw the sequence. "This isn't a marginal correction," he said. "It's a marker. Someone is flagging lines." "A flagging for whom?" I asked. He shrugged. "For editors, maybe. For donors, for whoever keeps this ledger." A new decision formed in me. If this was coordinated, then uncovering names in a hidden ledger could produce the chain of authority. That chain would tell me whether the falsification was personal or sponsored. Anna watched me while I made up my mind. Her eyes did not leave my face. She had a small vertical scar near her lip that rubbed when she worried it with her thumb. Marco leaned closer and said, "If we can find the private sub-collection, we'll find the ledger." The phrase private sub-collection sounded like a key. Anna's fingers brushed the accession slip, and she said, "There's a coded string in older cataloging systems. It sometimes indicates restricted holdings. I can try to pull a damaged folio that's listed as under conservation. There might be a slip inside." I watched her choose words. She was giving me a way deeper into the stacks and out from under institutional oversight. I thought of the ledger below the stacks like a physical pressure that could flatten the whole archival aid. The emotion inside me shifted again, doubt into a hard resolve. I said, "Bring it to the conservation room at 2. Marco and I will be there." I felt my voice steady as I spoke. The decision would mean trespass, but it would also produce proof. At 2 in the afternoon, Anna returned with a folio whose spine had been cracked and repaired. She laid it on the conservator's table and cut through the cotton backing with steady hands. The room smelled of latex and bleached paper. I glanced at my dog-eared moleskin notebook and found the earlier sketch of the damp ring pressed into its page. The ledger spine broke apart and a narrow slip of paper fell out, thin as onion skin and bearing a string of numbers written in a cramped hand. "There, Anna." Her voice was small. "Those accession numbers. They point below the stacks." She had the quill tucked behind her ear again, an old habit. Marco ran his finger along the inked line. "It's coded. Private entries. This isn't catalog protocol. This indexes something hidden. We followed the code that night. The restricted vault sits under the stacks in a low, ceilinged corridor where the pipes make a faint, continuous clack. The heavy door smelled of oil and iron. Anna produced a smudged, unsigned key she kept when the conservators worked late. She palmed it like a talisman and murmured a number as she unlocked the cabinet. Marco's hands were steady but fast, fingers working like someone diffusing a clock. Inside the cabinet were bound ledgers, sewn in dark cloth. Each ledger had careful marginal emendations, underlinings, and the same repeated sigil. The ledgers carried an index of names, donor names, editors, curators, The names matched certain benefactors whose gifts had come with conditions. I felt the air in the corridor tighten around the paper. My breath was shallow. Marco flipped pages with quick, practical movements and found an entry that matched our folio's corrected numeral. Here, he said, look. Helena Cade appears twice. Head of the catalogue committee, he traced a line connecting the ledger entry to an accession note. My chest closed. Professor Helena Cade's name opened a new degree of risk. Helena chaired the catalogue committee. She balanced scholarship with donors' wishes. She had influence and reputation. If her name was entangled, exposure would become personal danger for those who tried it. We left the cabinet with a camera and a quiet plan. Anna volunteered to stay on as a conservator the next morning to account for the missing ledger pages if anyone noticed. I told her no. I could let her take that risk alone. She shook her head and said, "You can do this without me, Elias. If I don't stay, they'll find the break and the page is gone and I am the only one who can explain it." Her fingers closed on the camera strap like she could hold herself in place. The decision to return to the stacks at night was mine, and I made it with my watch in my pocket and my fountain pen tapping the leather. Marco and I planned the route. Through the service corridor, past the reading room where a cleaning crew worked, then down to the restricted vault where the cabinet lived. We chose a slow, exact method. No running, no dramatic entries, slow removal, photograph, replace. The moral calculus did not feel like a slogan. It felt like a ledger itself, costs on one side, truth on the other. We breached the cabinet after midnight. The vault smelled of stone and old air. Marco held the lamp. Its glow fell flat and yellow across the spines. I used the camera's silent mode and photographed the soon ledger open to the marginal emendations. The repeated sigil showed up in the photographs, a ring of darker iron, gall around certain numerals. As I worked, someone moved behind us, Elias Marlowe, Professor Helena Cade, voice clipped and unsurprised. She stood framed in the doorway with the head curator and 2 security staff. The lamp caught the grey in her hair and made a stern line across her cheek. "You are not authorized here." I had expected deflection. I had not expected a direct confrontation with the committee chair at the vault. The presence of security turned the scene into an immediate threat. My hands tightened on the camera strap. Anna had not come. I swallowed. Helena's eyes passed over the open ledger and fixed on the marginal sigil. Her mouth tightened. "Professor Cade," I said, "there are systematic emendations tied to donor conditions. This ledger proves coordinated alteration." Helena's reaction was quick. She laughed once without humor. "Prove, or assume." She stepped closer and reached for the ledger. The head curator moved to intercept. Marco stepped in front of her and said, "Professor, we only photographed the page. We can discuss this with the committee." Helena turned to Marco. "Marco Silva, your fellowship does not authorize property disturbance. Step aside." Her tone aimed to reduce him to a procedural nuisance. Marco answered with a different rhythm. "Helena, your name appears in this ledger. Donors and editors are linked. People will want to know who authorized changes." He kept his voice low but steady. The exchange escalated fast. Helena snapped, "You have no right to expose committee records. I will call security. You will face consequences." The head curator moved toward the ledger and reached for it. I pushed my hand between his and the book. "Don't touch it," I said. The words left me in a clipped breath. My palm found the torn page that lay half, free at the ledger's edge. The torn edge had been damp once and folded back. I had not planned to tear anything, but the page hung like a flap, and I needed one concrete thing to stop the seizure. I ripped the sheet free with a single deliberate motion. Paper split with a thin, audible sound. Ink smeared along the torn edge and a sigil, partially hidden beneath a pasted-on note, came free in a smear of darker iron gall. The head curator's hand hovered over the ragged opening. Helena's face changed. For the first time she looked off. "Balance, Elias!" she barked. Security moved. One guard grabbed the page and then froze. The smear of ink on the torn edge matched the damp ring I had described earlier. Beneath the torn paper, a narrow marginal map printed on a thin slip showed a column of names and donor conditions coded in small letters. Someone had hidden it under the pasted note. The ledger's marginal map made the intent obvious. Deliberate fabrication and indexing. There was a rapid moment of silence. Then the head curator reached for the camera. Marco shoved his shoulder into the curator's chest. Helena hissed, "Seize the records." Now the guard pulled his radio. Anna's absence became a cost in that instant. Security moved toward us with a speed I did not expect. I had to act. The torn page smudged with the darker iron gall. My fingers found the camera and I snapped 4 quick photographs of the exposed map. Marco clutched the camera strap and hissed, "Elias, give it here." I handed it over. The lamp's glow threw sharp highlights on the pages. The guard's hand closed on Marco's collar and Anna's name flickered in my mind. Her offer to stay behind now a dangerous sacrifice. Helena reached for the ledger again. Marco stepped between her and the book. "Professor Helena," he said, "take a step back. This is evidence. People will need to see it." Her name in a way that insisted she was accountable. For a beat she looked at him, as if weighing the public cost. Then she made a move I did not expect. Helena signaled security to seize the ledger and said, "Take them out." Both of them. The guards closed in. Marco shoved a shoulder to one and ducked under the other's reach. I twisted and felt the camera slip. The ledger went with a soft ripping sound as a second sheet tore loose under the gyring of bodies. The torn fragment fluttered free, and ink smudged across my thumb. Someone swore. The head curator reached for the torn fragment and his fingers smeared the map further. A sudden, sharp sound came from the doorway. Anna had returned. She stood framed by the arch with a plate in her hand and a handkerchief tucked into her fist. "Stop," she said. Her voice cut the room down to one line. She walked forward and looked straight at Helena. "You will not take these pages. I will accept responsibility for the conservation breach." Her palms were open. She did not reach for the ledger. The head curator hesitated. "Anna," I said. My voice dropped. "Don T." She answered me through the room. "Elias, you should have told me you were going to do this. But I know what will happen if I do not take blame. They will pin the brake on a conservator and no one will ask why the pages were marked. They will not look for the ledger." That line changed the stakes. Guilt and a new kind of resolve passed through me. Marco stepped forward and said, "Anna, we can fight this. We can present the photographs." "Let us." Anna shook her head. "You two will be watched. I will be blamed. It is the way they will let the ledger vanish without scandal. If I take it, the committee will close the case. You can publish the images. You can make them read the ledger. I will be the scapegoat." Her voice had no tremor. She had decided. The room held on that single action. I felt my hands go cold. I imagined her in the morning, called before the committee to explain why a conservator had torn a folio. I thought of the risk to her job, to her reputation. I thought of my own signature on a letter that might condemn her if I did not act. "Anna," I said. And my voice narrowed to a question. "Are you certain?" She met my gaze. Yes. Her fingers found the torn page and folded it into a small square. She tucked it into her sleeve. The head curator stepped forward, red in the face, and said, "You'll be escorted to the registrar. We'll decide on sanctions." He sounded like a man reading from an instruction manual. Marco made a quick move and whispered, "Take a photograph." Now he held the camera to Anna's sleeve. I heard the shutter click. The sudden smallness of the sound made the risk real. Security moved to escort Anna away. She did not resist. She turned and walked through the doorway, shoulders straight. Helena's mouth was a tight line. She watched Anna go as if counting cost. Once the door closed, the room felt both full and empty. Marco looked at me and said, "We have what we need. We have the ledger photograph and the torn map shot." But Anna just took the blame. I touched the smear of ink on my thumb and felt a pulse of rage. My chest tightened with an urge to run after her, to stop it. Marco reached out and caught my arm. "Elias, we can bring her back into that room." "Not yet." She chose this. "Now finish the record. We need a chain of proof before they can bury it." We moved fast after that. Marco guided me while I photographed the ledger from multiple angles, preserving the map and the marginal sigils in high resolution. We replaced pages the best we could and closed the ledger. The head curator filed a formal complaint. Helena left without another word, her posture controlled. The guards followed her out with the same heavy steps they had brought in. Outside, the stone courtyard was bright with dawn. I had a photograph on a memory card and a torn page still thumbed into Anna's sleeve somewhere inside the registrar's office. Marco and I slipped through a service door and walked under the library's arcade. The air was thin and cold. I thought of the ledger's index of names and of the donors who would react if their alterations were known. I thought of the cost Anna had accepted. What now? Marco, we trace the names, I said. My voice was flat. We publish a controlled dossier. We protect Anna as much as we can. I thought of my brass pocket watch in my satchel and the dog-eared moleskine notebook. I thought of the damp ring from Chapter 1 and how it had led me here. Memory had become evidence. Marco nodded. And Helena? He asked. I looked back at the dark doorway we had left. Professor Cade stood framed for a moment, then entered the building again. Her silhouette swallowed by the stone. We learn how deep the ledger runs, I said, and we prepare for the cost. We walked away with the photographs between us like a small, dangerous map. The weight of proof pressed at the edges of my plan. I had expected opposition. I had not expected a colleague to choose blame. Anna's choice made the conflict concrete and urgent. My next move would have to account for Anna's sacrifice. The ledger had moved from theory to object, from suspicion to proof. The moral account was no longer abstract. It sat in my satchel as a set of images and a smear of dark ink on my thumb. At dawn, I took one last look through the courtyard toward the registrar's doorway. A small figure in a conservator's coat disappeared inside. I pressed my fountain pen to the edge of my notebook and wrote one sentence. Trace chain. Protect Anna. Publish ledger. I closed the notebook, felt the leather strap under my fingers, and slipped the clandestine photograph into my satchel. A bell rang in the chapel across the quad. It sounded ordinary and precise. I walked to the gate, memory of the damp footnote pressed into my mouth like grit, and left the library with the ledger's photograph burning in the pocket closest to my heart. The chapter that had begun with an inked quill at midnight ended with a choice that tasted of iron and cold dawn. I could feel the shift inside me from suspicion to obligation. The ledger below the stacks had changed what truth would cost. Professor Braith slammed a clipped reference onto the lacquered table and said, "Stop prying, Elias." Suspicion tightened my hands around the folder as everyone in the dim common room turned toward us. The line landed like a physical shove. Someone wanted me to stop, and the warning carried the weight of university formality and private menace. Within the next minute I saw the clipped reference for what it was, an edited page, a single footnote circled in a different ink, and I understood the concrete stakes, access, reputation, and the record itself. I had no time for explanation. I set the folio down and pushed my spectacles up with a finger that still carried the faint iron, gall stain from the first folio. Lucia was at the doorway behind Braith, her shoulders rigid under a wool coat. Anna stood nearer, the quill I had seen in Chapter 2 now hidden in her palm. Suspicion, the word arrived already formed in my throat, guided my next steps. I moved to block Braith from retreating toward the corridor where the senior common room doors locked at midnight. "Professor Braith," I said. "You can demand I simply stop when manuscripts are being altered." My voice did not waver. My mouth felt dry. He folded the clipped reference once, then twice, and his eyes flicked to Lucia Elias. "Braith, you are making an enemy of people who can end your access." He spoke with the soft, exact cadence of a man used to safe rooms and measured threats. "This isn't about scholarship. This is about what keeps the university solvent." His hand drifted toward a pocket without showing a gesture. His tone was meant to close the conversation. Lucia stepped forward. "Professor, there are protocols." Her voice had the authority of an archivist who handles fragile things with gloved hands. "If he has evidence, we document it." Anna nothing for a beat. Then she put the quill flat on the table in front of her and folded her fingers over it. I remembered the damp circle of iron, gall I had found on the folio in special collections, the ink ring still tacky when I first lifted the vellum. I remembered catching Anna with a quill over a margin, seeing her stop when I reached for the folio. Those 2 images had driven me here tonight. They were not memory phrases, they were actions I could show and prove. I brought the folio forward and opened to the marked page. The circled footnote had been penned in a darker tone than the rest of the scribe's hand. Braith glanced at the folio, then at Lucia. "You saw this?" he asked Lucia in a low voice. Lucia did not avert her eyes. "I did, and I brought it to Elias because conservation flagged a different ink under ultraviolet this morning," she the phrase plainly. "Clinical as a report. We should not act without the proper chain of custody." Her hands were steady. The veneer of procedure was meant to cool the immediate heat of accusation. "Chain of custody," Braith repeated. "I can arrange that." Privately, he smiled without moving his mouth. Privately is often better for all of us. There are donors who worry about scandal. The sentence hung there, meaning payments and patronage, and the line connected in my head to the ledger entry's meter. Sorrel hinted at later that night. Anna finally looked at me. "Alias, there's a restricted accession Lucia can open for us if we ask properly," she said. Her voice was tight but practical. "I can get her to cooperate. She my name like someone counting risks aloud." I nodded once, then "Let's do it now." The decision felt like a hinge. I pushed my chair back. Braith made a movement to follow, then stopped and walked away into the corridor. He left the clipped reference as an implied threat. We moved as a unit through the dim archive corridors. The locks smelled of copper. The floorboards moaned underfoot. Anna's hands brushed my satchel in a way that felt like apology. Lucia led us down a narrow stair to a reading room sealed by a keypad. She punched in a code with practiced fingers, then propped the door for us with a wooden wedge she pulled from her sleeve. The wedge made a dry, small noise that sounded enormous in the stillness. Inside the restricted room, I placed the folios and catalogue cards on a long oak table. I ran my fountain pen across a margin to test the texture of the paper the way a conservator tests warmth on vellum. The group worked in a rotation. Anna pulled folios, Lucia held them to the light, and I compared marginalia. The tiny sigil I had traced in Chapter 2 began to emerge across separate collections, a repeating swirl tucked beneath marginal numbers, erased strokes that stopped and began at the same points. Doubt shifted to a sterner edge as the pattern emerged. The marginal sigil repeated on a 15th century register, a 17th century ledger, and a 19th century donor letter. My chest contracted with the physical realization that the tampering was not a single clerk's mistake, but coordinated action. I ran my nails along an erasure and felt the paper's raised grain. On the underside, under ultraviolet, a second ink had been applied then faded. Someone had used a palimpsest-like technique to hide later additions beneath apparent corrections. This is deliberate, Anna. This is not sloppy. This is methodical. She pulled a catalogue card from the pile and laid it beside the folio. "Look at the hand here." And then on the folio. "It's not the same writer, but the corrections share an angle. Someone taught whoever did this to use a particular nib angle." Her fingers trembled as she spoke, but the trimmer was useful. It made the threat real. We spread folios on the table until the surface looked like an accusation. Lucia fetched raking light and a conservation lamp. When she moved the lamp, the raised erasures cast thin, precise shadows that traced the pattern of the tampering across unrelated volumes. The shadows made the sigil look intentional and ritualistic, but I kept my description concrete. The strokes were consistently shorter on the left, hand margin and hooked upward on the third stroke, always ending within 2 millimeters of the catalogue number. A sound at the door made us all flinch. The keypad clicked. The wedge shifted. Someone had moved the wedge from the outside and knocked. Lucia's jaw tightened. I went to the door and peered through the narrow glass. 2 security officers stood in the corridor. One held a clipboard with my name typed on a form. The other had the tight expression of someone who had been told to follow orders without question. "Jutta Marlowe," the security officer asked. "We have a notice revoking your access. Administration requests you leave the restricted reading room immediately." He read the notice in a way that made it formal and absolute. My mouth closed. Anna moved first. "Elias, you should go with them," she said. We can talk to Lucia later." Her attention looked toward Lucia, asking if there was any way to argue. Lucia shook her head once the motion almost invisible. I handed the folio to Lucia. "Photograph everything," I said. "Record the catalogue cards. Take notes on the lamp positions." My voice was clipped to give instructions. Lucia's fingers were already dialing a camera. I could feel the shift inside me. Suspicion had become distrust, and distrust now demanded an action I had prepared for, to preserve evidence whether or not the university allowed me to remain. At midnight a message led me to Mr. Sorrel's book dealer parlor. He sat amid stacks and portfolios under a low lamp. The room smelled of glue, old leather, and a faint citrus polish. He opened a provenance ledger and slid it toward me with 2 fingers. "You should have left this alone. Dra. Marlowe, Mr. Sorrel." His voice was flat, not angry. He pointed to a column of entries, names matched with payment amounts and shelf marks, donors and faculty. Payments to people who can make inconvenient references disappear. Some of these payments are labeled as endowments. Others are marked off. Book. He tapped a line where a senior's name aligned with a folio that had the same marginal sigil we had seen. "Why show me this?" I asked. He smiled. The smile was small, and he moved his eyes like a man who measured reactions. "Because you asked, Elias. Because you are impossible." He closed the ledger softly. "Also because I want to see where you take it." He placed a visiting card on top, and the card had an address and a time scratched into the corner. At that moment I felt anger and alarm converge. Alarm because the ledger gave motive and scale. Anger because the ledger made the theft look like institutional management, not mere forgery. I closed my hand over the visiting card and left with the tightness behind my ribs growing into something like speed. Back at the archive the following morning, there was an official notice on the entrance revoking my privileges. The notice was laminated and stamped. A clerk at the desk refused to give me a list of appeals without written authorization. Anna was not at the desk. Later I would learn she had been called in for questioning by administrators. The small shift, Anna's absence, struck a blow harder than any letter. My suspicion had become dread. If they could make access disappear, they could make people vanish from the institutional record. I found Anna in a narrow office. Her hands were raw where the quill rested in her palm. She looked up and closed the file in her lap as I entered. "Anna," I said. "Elias," she said. "They why I was in the restricted room last night. They me to explain myself." I lied. She kept her voice level. I said I was taking inventory in my capacity as research assistant. It would have been worse if I'd said we were investigating. Her shoulders were hunched in a way that made her look smaller than her years. "Who called you in?" I asked Administrator Cole. "He about Mr. Sorrel." Anna's face went pale at his name. The university prefers to handle sensitive issues quietly. He didn't use the word cover, but he used one that meant the same thing. Her hands clenched into fists on her knees. "We argued next, quick and sharp." "Anna, you should have told them we had proof." I said. "Elias," she shot back. "I told them small, plausible things." "What would you have had me do? Walk in and demand a public inquiry?" Her words were short. The back and forth had the speed of people pressing against a shared danger. "You could have called Lucia," I said. "Lucia is already under pressure," Anna replied. She had a conservation report to deliver. She can't afford to be fired. The exchange lasted 3 breaths. Then she sat back and exhaled. The next morning at the conservation lab, Lucia ran a sequence that changed everything. She spread one of the suspect folios under a microscope and applied a simple chemical bath used in conservation to distinguish carbon-based iron, gall ink from later editions. Under the scope, the supposed corrections separated into layers. Beneath the visible ink, a faint ledger of names and amounts revealed itself when Lucia gently swabbed a regent across the margin. "Look," Lucia, pointing. Her finger hovered near the glass lens, not touching. "There's a ledger beneath. Names, amounts, dates, receipts tucked under ink." She read a line aloud, "To be allocated. £5,000, Braith." "Look." Her voice was steady, but the syllables dropped like stones. I reached to steady the slide. The letters under the ink were not part of the original scribe. They had been written later, then covered with a darker correction. Someone had literally written payments into the margins and then obscured them. The palimpsest technique reappeared, erased, overwritten, concealed, a ledger within the ledger. My anger reformed into a brittle clarity. If we could point to these specific names and amounts, we could demonstrate motive and method. But the discovery triggered a practical question: how to extract and preserve a copy without alerting the network that manipulated the archive. We needed a place to photograph, a place to store copies, and eyes outside the university. That night, a discreet envelope with a meeting time slid under my flat's door. The vault beneath the library should not have been possible to reach. The door required authorization and a key held by the head archivist. We did not have that. We had something else. Lucia's familiarity with the building's maintenance schedule, Anna's ability to access personnel files, and my willingness to break a door when the lock could mean the difference between evidence and a rumor. We planned our entry across the span of an hour. We did not rehearse words, we rehearsed movements. Anna would distract the cameras by signing a late night delivery slip. Lucia would be waiting with a conservation blanket. I carried a small, soft torch and my camera. The decision to go in felt like a sequence of small betrayals against the rules I had sworn to respect. Each action tightened the knot in my chest, but the weight of proof made each step necessary. We forced the vault door with a simple mechanical trick. The lock yielded with a brittle sound and a spray of dust. The vault held a ritualized arrangement. Folios stacked like a manual, catalog cards threaded over one another, and on the central table a donor register that had been annotated not with scholastic comments, but with names and amounts aligned like a ledger of favors. Professor Braith was there, but not in the way I expected. He stood by the table, palms flat on the wood, and did not look surprised to see us. "You should be here, Elias Braith." His voice had the same measured quality as before, but now it carried anger. He did not ask why we had come. He stated it as fact. "Professor Braith." I said name and amount. I pointed at a column in the ledger that matched entries we'd seen under ultraviolet. He did not deny the entries. Instead, he looked at Lucia and said, "You shouldn't have shown him that, Lucia." The rapid exchange that followed between Braith, Lucia, and Anna snapped like a wire. "Professor, those are donor records, Lucia. People gave money. That doesn't justify forging references." Her voice rose by a fraction. "Those references make scholarship legible," Braith replied. "They make narrative. They make the institution coherent. You want chaos. Publish everything raw and watch chairs be lost. Watch departments decapitate themselves." He spoke with the trained cruelty of someone comfortable with administrative violence. Anna stepped forward. "Elias and I found altered footnotes." She said, "They tie to payments. You know that. You know who benefits." Her words were short and delivered in quick succession, 3 lines that landed like punches. Braith's face tightened. "You have no proof in a court of inquiry," he said. "We have a ledger under ink." Lucia answered, "We have ultraviolet layers. We have photographic copies." Her voice moved from report to demand. Braith moved faster than I expected. He set both hands on the ledger and pushed it toward me. "Then you have a choice, Elias," he said. "You can publish this and tear the university apart, ruin colleagues, and risk losing the archive itself. Or you can place the ledger with me, and I will manage the consequences. I will ensure the donors continue to fund research. I will not have you burn down the house you are living in." The offer was not polite. It was a transaction. A confrontation unfolded in 3 quick exchanges. "You want me to hand over evidence?" I ask. "You want stability?" Braith, "You want cover?" Anna shot back. The rapid back and forth had the count of a small battle. 6 lines that changed the room's posture. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden clarity of what obedience would cost colleagues, and what exposure might cost my career. At the center of the table, the ledger waited like an accused thing. Lucia reached for it and then stopped. She looked at Braith, then at Anna, then at me. "If we hand it to him, he'll bury the paper in a safe, and we will be the whisperers accusing him later. Lucia, if we publish, Anna will be investigated, I will be fired, and the donors will pull funding. Either way, there is a cost." Her fingers tightened on the edge of the page. The action showed the inner calculation. My mind ran through scenarios rapidly. Freeze the ledger in duplicate and release to a journalist. No, journalists lack the expertise to verify palimpsest analysis without being fed a precise chain of evidence. Hand it to the university ombudsman. They are appointed by the same senior faculty who stand to lose. Give it to Mr. Sorrell. He already hinted at motives and had private leverage. Each path punished someone. Each path preserved or destroyed reputations. The room narrowed into a single choice. Expose and fracture the institution, or conceal and preserve the archive while letting the corruption continue. My right hand found the single folio I had slipped into my satchel earlier, the compromise I had taken from a shelf before the break, in a page with a name and a done notation that implicated a single, tangible transaction. I placed the folio on top of the ledger and put my palm over both. I will not hand the ledger to you, Professor, I said. But I will not publish it tonight either. My voice was quiet, measured. The decision was deliberate and costly. It was also public within the four of us in the vault. Braith's face changed in the way that men used to polite coercion change when they lose rhetorical control. You are making a mistake, he said. Maybe, I replied. But I have photographs. I will take them. I will keep one folio here and I will deliver copies to a place outside this university if anything happens to me. I will give you a chance to resolve this internally, Lucia Anna, but if you conspire to bury it, I will go to the press. That is the choice. You can protect people and hold them to account, or you can protect money and ruin the archive. The sentence was not rhetoric. It was a set of actions I was already arranging in my head. Lucia looked at me as if weighing trust against ruin. Then she nodded once. Anna's jaw flexed and she closed her fist. Braith cut the air with his hand and said, so be it. But know this, choices have consequences. He did not threaten with words. He implied institutional machinery. We left the vault as the first light of dawn slipped into the library. Photographs were on my camera. Lucia had pocketed a conservation slip and a small copy of the ledger's cover. Anna walked beside me without speaking. At the gate, a campus porter scanned faces and let us through. I felt the campus waking. Bicycles, a porter with a thermos, a postgraduate hurrying with a stack of notebooks. When I reached the stone steps, I paused. The day felt ordinary in the small details. Pigeons flapped on the balustrade, a courier cycled by. The ordinary details did not soothe. They made the choice sharper. I had made an action that would change people's lives. I buttoned my coat, tucked the single folio inside my satchel, and stepped onto the stone steps as the bell began to toll. My decision was an action that would ripple outward. Behind me, I heard the vault door close, the sound of a lock resetting. Lucius' footsteps receded down the corridor and Anna's breathing measured the distance between us. I walked into the morning with photographs in the camera and a ledger of names in my head, knowing the next move would determine whether truth would be a weapon or a remedy. At the threshold of the courtyard a voice called, "G. de Marlowe." I turned. It was a junior porter with a delivery slip in his hand. He extended it toward me and said, "You left this in the reading room last night." The slip bore my name and a stamp from administration. The action was small and concrete. It closed the circle and opened the next problem. I folded the slip and slipped it into my pocket. The morning did not answer me. It only set the clock. Emotion shifts, suspicion to distrust as Braith warned me, distrust to alarm as ledger evidence surfaced, alarm to brittle resolve in the vault. Each turn of feeling moved me to a specific act, to photograph, to break a lock, to withhold publication, and to preserve a folio. The chapter ends on a concrete beat. The porter returning my delivery slip and the bell toll beginning its slow count. That single moment decides the next move and ensures the conflict continues with real, tangible consequences. I stepped into the stone courtyard and grabbed the parcel from Anna's hands before she could move. Suspicion tightened my fingers around the sealed vellum. "Anna, stop," I said, and the cold of dawn hit us as Dean Calder straightened from the coping stone. Suspicion was not new. It had been a slow, physical friction since the damp ink ring I found in the margins. Now it pushed me forward. Within seconds I had slit the wax and folded back the vellum. The annotated folio slid out, edges curled with fresh creases and recent iron, gall that still darkened when my thumb touched it. The courtyard's flagstones took the chill and gave none back. I moved through the small crowd that had gathered, Anna tense at my side, Calder frozen with an official face, Professor Braith half in the doorway watching. My hands were steady but my throat tightened. The problem was plain: evidence of deliberate tampering and a packet meant for the Dean's private review. If the annotations were authentic forgeries, they were not random. The same cipher I had seen before threaded them together. My motive was simple now: expose the forgery or be complicit. I could smell wax and damp vellum and the sharp metallic tang of iron gall ink on my fingertips. Anna's eyes flicked to the circle of darker ink around a footnote numeral Elias, she said. Her voice was small. She could not finish. Her fingers trembled where they held a folded catalogue card with a stamped provenance. The provenance read like a history of trust. Adonis' name, a shelf mark, a dated accession stamp. The stamps looked right at first glance. Under one I found, with a magnifier, a faint, repeated marginal cipher, 3 small strokes and a dot beneath the collector's signature. The cipher matched the one I had seen when I lifted the folio weeks earlier and found the damp ring. I felt my suspicion harden into anger. I said, "Dean Calder, what is this?" Calder cleared his throat and stepped forward. He spoke with the measured cadence of administration. "Dieu de Marlowe, those are internal materials." "You should not have, then explain why the accession reads as if it came from Bishop Harrow's chest," I interjected. "Explain why the ink in the margin is newer than the script." My voice cut short over the stones. Professor Braith pushed past the dean and slammed a clipped reference on a ledge, an action I remembered from my memory of the common room. The sound landed as accusation. "Stop prying, Elias Braith." His jaw worked. "Stop this now." He reached for the folios. I stepped back and held the pages above the cold air where anyone could see the handwriting alterations. Braith's face was controlled. He tried a different tactic: administrative error, Calder, a misfiled note. Human mistake. The dean's palms were open. An attempt at calm. "Human mistake does not explain the cipher," I said. Anna's hand found mine. Elias, the quill." Her voice halted on the first syllable. She had been caught with a quill over the margin in the locked reserve. I remembered that precise movement. Her eyes were fixed on the same repeated strokes I had traced days before. The memory of my right index finger pressing a margin that smelled of glue and brass returned as a physical H. "I found the note," she said, I thought. She looked at Calder as if asking for permission to explain. Calder's mouth tightened. "This is not Anna's doing alone," he said. "We have protocols." "You are upsetting an institution." His last sentence was a warning wrapped in policy. The courtyard remained a stage for authority, stones, columns, and the university crest carved above the arch. My anger slid toward a sharper clarity. This was not a clerical error. We moved to the courtyard steps. I spread the folios on a low ledge and began to inspect each marginal note with a small lens. The forgeries were careful. Paper matched old stock, the ink tone was blended, and the hand betrayed minor slips meant to imitate a 17th century hand. But the provenance slips were the giveaway. Someone had layered legitimate marks, donor names, shelf marks, over altered accession records. Each altered footnote carried the same marginal cipher. When arranged, the cipher tied specific footnotes together across volumes. That pattern meant coordination. Anna swallowed. "Alias, look," she pointed. "This card. There is a smudge that matches the ink on the ledger you found below the stacks." She was recalling the ledger I had opened in the locked reserve, the same scene where I had seen her with a quill, and the iron gall still wet. I felt a surge of vindication and unease at once. Vindication for being right. Unease because the operation was larger than we had imagined. We could not stay on the steps. Calder called security, his voice tight, but he did not call them to seize the parcel. He called to move the situation out of the open. I led Anna to the dean's office. Braith followed. Calder sat behind his lacquered desk and attempted to frame the evidence away with administrative terms. "A chain of custody error. Calder, we will conduct an internal review." He pushed a hand toward the folios as if to shepherd them back into the system. I did not hand them over. Professor Braith, you slammed a reference earlier. You stopped prying, Elias. Why? I said. My voice kept to the narrow cadence I used for lectures. Braith's face changed. He looked less like the scholar I had known and more like a man defending an unearned legacy. Braith answered with clipped words, "You are making allegations without proof. Then explain why the accession stamps repeat in 3 separate series with the same marginal cipher." I said. "Explain why Lucia Voss' ledger shows overwritten microfilm entries." I used Lucia's name deliberately. Lucia Voss was head archivist. She had a reputation for strict exactness and a stubborn refusal to bend records to politics. Naming her shifted the room. Calder's eyes flicked, and for a long, measured breath the dean almost smiled. "We will pull the microfilm. Calder, we will have the archivist review it." His tone promised process but not transparency. We moved below the stacks. The subterranean archive smelled of glue, metal, and the detergents used to keep machines running. Lucia Voss worked the microfilm reader with methodical hands. Her hair was pulled back tight, her spectacles low, and the catalog sequence in front of her was a grid of numbers and tape labels. She slid a spool into place and threaded the film. The reader hummed. Lucia did not look surprised when I told her what I had found. She only narrowed her eyes and fed the film through the lens. "Elias, Lucia, you found the ring again." Her voice was flat, precise. "This cipher has been embedded across decades. Not a single volume." She pushed the reel forward and back and then stopped. Her finger hovered over a faint set of marks on the film. "There. See the marginal cluster at accession 1201. The same 3 strokes and a dot." She tapped the screen. I watched the projected grain, the ledger columns, and a series of marks that had been invisible when printed on paper. Lucia pulled up the catalog sequence and overlaid a retrieval log. The overlay showed dates, donors, and curator notes. When she blinked the microfilm forward, the repeated cipher aligned across different donors and decades. The pattern matched our folios. Lucia's mouth pressed into a thin line. "This is not clerical hustle," she said. "This is an ordering principle." Her hands showed no tremor. "Someone is arranging these marginalia so that when mapped they form a system." My suspicion shifted again into a cold, focused dread. The cipher was not merely a conspiratorial shorthand. It formed a matrix. In an instant I understood that the altered footnotes functioned like coordinates. Whoever engineered them had created a layered provenance so that future readers would find a constructed authority. Footnotes that referenced each other across texts to produce an illusion of consensus. They had built a false scaffolding of scholarship. Lucia slid me a thumb drive strapped to a paperclip. "Digitize these now," she said. "Get copies outside before anyone can claim custody." Her voice left no room for debate. Anna set up the scanner with hands that did not stop shaking. I watched the light sweep across folio pages as the machine fed and recorded. Every click and whir was an act of theft and preservation at once. Our urgency drew attention. Professor Braith and a security detail arrived moments later. Braith's first words were a clipped string. "You cannot remove originals from university property." He came in with his voice thin but forceful. "You will hand them to proper preservation." His hands were steady now, ready to push back. There followed a scrape of voices. I said, "You stop prying, Braith. Why are you defending the chain now?" He answered, "Because you are breaking trust, Elias. Because your method endangers donors." The back and forth sharpened. Rapid lines cut between us. "You are covering it up," I said. "We will submit to an oversight committee." Calder answered, "We will not have leaks." Braith added, "Leaks will ruin reputations." Sinclair, when he arrived, stepping through the archive door with a trustee's emissary's ease. Mr. Sinclair is a large man in a plain suit, with hands that fold the same way each time he speaks. He walked in with a neutral smile and an envelope under his arm. "Dre. Marlowe," he said, "do not make an enemy of the institution on principle." His tone was businesslike. "There are ways to protect careers. Quietly. Your safety, your position. Bury it. Accept a fellowship elsewhere." His offer was blunt. "In exchange, you keep the original secrets. You help us keep the university whole." I remember pressing my thumb against a folio edge until the nail whitened. Suspicion had moved through anger and dread, and now something else tightened, resignation at the possible personal cost. So we either destroy our careers or destroy the record, I said. My voice had a flatness that startled me. Sinclair's smile did not crack. Or you accept protection and avoid scandal. He folded the envelope across his palm. Career protection is a real thing. Drer. Marlowe he it like an accountant listing options. Anna answered before I could. You offered me a position in the reserves, she said. You me to manage Dunner lists. Her voice had steel. I kept quiet because I thought I was keeping the archive functioning. She looked directly at Calder. You me it was maintenance. Her words forced the room to accept that others had been drawn into tasks and told different stories. Sinclair tried to reframe it. We ask you to be reasonable. Braith tried to appeal to decorum. This is not how scholars behave. Lucia cut in. This is how records are bent. Leave the originals with me or we lose the only way to prove it. Her voice was hard. We decided quickly to digitize everything we could. The restricted digitization room was a narrow space with a scanner, a small server rack, and one window that did not open. We worked in a sync of practiced motions. Anna fed pages, Lucia adjusted resolution, I labeled files and scanned accession stamps. The ancient folios slid under the scanner light, and each scan produced a pale rectangle of pixels where ink sat like bruises on paper. We watched each image display and then copied onto multiple encrypted drives. Outside, the corridor echoed with footsteps. Security arrived in force, led by a man with a clipped badge who announced they were there to secure university property. Professor Braith moved to intercept the door and tried to figure a way to legally detain our work. Voices rose into a cadence of orders and rebuttals. Hold there, the head guard said. We have instructions to secure originals, Lucia answered. I have authorization to export copies. The guard looked at the paperwork, and then at the drives in Lucia's hand. The exchange was a staccato of policy and counter-policy. I saw Sinclair's face in the doorway as if he were watching from above. The situation compressed. For a moment the server room became a contest of control. Braith tried to reach for the folios. I stepped between him and the table. He grabbed the edge of a folio. I pulled back. The pages fluttered. A rapid series of actions followed. A shove from Braith, a startled cry from Anna, a hand knocking a jar of lamp oil off a nearby bench. When the jar shattered, oil ran across the table toward the fiberboard boxes that held the microfilm. I smelled the petrochemical sharpness and saw the spark as one of the lights caught a drop. The room filled with a sudden, practical danger. No one spoke of symbolism. Everyone reacted. I moved to pick up the folios and carry them outside. Braith lunged and got a sleeve on my coat. Anna shoved him backward. Lucia yanked a cable to shut the scanner down to avoid an electrical surge. I made the decision in the span of a breath. The forged apparatus could be weaponized against future scholars. If we kept the originals, they could be manipulated again. If we destroyed them, we prevented further misuse, but removed the physical proof that someone could interrogate in court or by committee. The digitized copies were our only shield. I took a book lighter from my pocket, my well-used fountain pen's companion, and set the edge of a folio alight on the courtyard stone where dawn had burned its first grey alias. No! Calder shouted. Mr. Sinclair lunged. Professor Braith stepped forward with a clipped expletive. Anna shoved a bundle of microfilm onto the flames before Sinclair could reach her hand. The film curled and burned with a thin, sinister hiss. Lucia pulled a thumb drive from her skirt and, with hands that did not stop, connected it to the server and began to transmit the files to a secure external node she had prepared earlier. Her voice was steady. Uploading now, she said. I will not let them vanish again. The server's indicator lights blinked like a collation of witnesses. The bonfire took quickly. Pages blackened and a thin smoke rose into the courtyard air, carrying the smell of scorched vellum and iron gall. Calder's face lost color. Braith reached into the flame and tried to snatch a folio. His fingers pulled back scorched. Security hit the courtyard gate with boots and shouted for order. Someone grabbed at my wrist. I felt pain. I felt a tug. I felt a small blister forming on the thumb that had held that damp ring in the first chapter. Anna's hand pushed microfilm ash into the flame until nothing legible remained. The fight was not long. Sinclair, realizing the optics, barked orders into his phone and signaled the guards to stand down. Calder called for containment and threatened suspension. Lucia hit the final command to complete the upload and then yanked the drive free. She tucked the drives into her coat and handed one to Anna. "Get them to the secure channel now," she said. Guards arrived and Calder demanded documentation. The university wanted to assert control over the narrative immediately. Calder called in a council. Bray demanded an inquiry into my conduct. I watched the embers and felt a sorrow that was precise and physical, like something being unstitched from the fabric of a long life. Anna's face had soot on her cheek. She brushed it away with the back of her hand and then looked at me. We left the courtyard in different ways. Calder stayed to coordinate containment. Brather moved to the dean's office to draft official statements. Sinclair walked away with a neutral expression and a tacit promise of consequences. Lucia sealed the digitized copies behind encrypted layers and transmitted one final packet to a secure leak I had helped her configure weeks earlier. Then she returned to the stacks and began, slowly, to reconstruct the microfilm trail with whatever surviving frames existed. That night, midnight found me in an isolated reading room with a single lamp and my satchel at my knees. The lamp light made the burnt bookmarks' edges glow. Anna had come by to deliver a small sealed envelope and had left before dawn. Lucia had sent word that the files were propagating through independent repositories. The leaks began to appear on academic lists and an obscure blog by morning. The university scrambled, press releases, threats, calls for restraint. The official line tried to frame my actions as reckless. The public line began to ask clear questions. I accepted a quiet exile by morning. It arrived as a typed letter from a committee chair and a stipulation. Resign your post, accept a fellowship outside the university, and do not pursue litigation. The letter was formal and final. I signed. The decision felt like a physical severing. I put my fountain pen down and pressed hard enough that the pad beneath left an imprint. There were immediate consequences. Professor Braith's name circulated in private messages. Calder's status wavered. Sinclair continued, as men like him do, to move quietly in corridors of power. Lucius' name appeared briefly in a gossip column, a faint smear she did not deserve. Anna received anonymous threats by the end of the week and took a temporary leave to stay with her family. Each of those outcomes was concrete and measurable. None were airy moral lessons. In the days that followed, I counted what remained. Digitized copies circulated and began to dismantle constructed authorities. Scholars wrote careful queries. A department convened an independent panel. The pattern Lucia had found, the cipher as an ordering principle, was replicated by at least 2 independent teams who had received the same digital packet. The forgery's architecture started to unravel when other hands examined the images and traced the repeated marginal strokes across volumes. The twist that altered everything came when a historian outside the university found a marginal cipher in a private collection catalogue, annotated by a dunner with the same 3 strokes and a dot, and a brief note that read, in a 17th century hand for the ordering of posterity. The donor's family, traced through probate records, produced correspondence showing payments directed to a now deceased patron who had funded several bequests to our university during a period when Braith's academic lineage had been ascendant. Evidence suggested a deliberate network. Donors, curators, and administrators who had, over decades, manufactured consensuses inside Footnotes. That revelation shifted the case from internal scandal to organized manipulation. It also made the absence of originals more comprehensible. The bonfire had been an ugly, immediate act. It also prevented the physical apparatus from being reused to stage a later pattern by someone who sought to weaponize altered provenance. Lucius' digital packet ensured the forensic trail remained available even without the originals. Months moved by with hearings, quiet settlements, and a reluctant public accounting. My resignation circulated with a careful statement. Anna returned to the city in a faculty role at a smaller institution. She sent me a list of microfilm frames she had managed to photograph before leaving. Lucia's work gained a slow recognition. She was invited to consult on archival security lines. Professor Braith's position was reviewed. An inquiry found him negligent though not criminally complicit. Calder retired early. Mr. Sinclair's name evaporated from headlines but continued to appear in trustee minutes. The personal cost was clear. I lost my office, my access badge, and the straight line of a career I had expected. I also kept the knowledge of what had been done. The cipher, the pattern, the names that formed the net. I had a pile of digitized files, correspondence, and a handful of printed images that Lucia had smuggled out in the days after the bonfire. I could have tried to litigate, to make the university answer in court. I chose instead to move with the work. I left the city where the university sat and took a fellowship in a library that had no official links to my former employers. The space was smaller and the funding modest. It was a home where careful cataloging mattered. I set up a workstation and began to trace the cipher across sources that had never before been networked. I wrote articles and sent them to journals that would consider the evidence. Some refused. Some accepted with hesitation. The leaks multiplied. Scholars published replication studies and forensic ink analysis. The narrative shifted from rumor to documented practice. Anna called me once, late at night. Elias, she said, you did the right thing. Her voice was rough. They threatened everything. They still do. But the copies are out there. People are reading them. Did you get the microfilm frames I left? I asked. Yes, she said. I burned what I couldn't to risk keeping. I kept what mattered. Her brevity let me know she had not resolved everything, that threats still lived in the margins of her inbox. Lucia sent me a packet with a final note. The cipher will not vanish, it will mutate. Guard the copies and teach others what to look for. Her handwriting on the envelope was her typical, careful ascender and loop. Her note had no dramatics. It contained a list of consultations and a promise to publish the catalog sequences under an open license. At night I still feel the memory of the flames and the weight of hot paper between fingers. The physical scar on my thumb where the folio blisters formed is a small, stubborn reminder. The moral choices remain concrete. The decision to destroy originals to prevent future manipulation, the choice to distribute the evidence instead of hoarding it, the acceptance of exile over compromise. Each choice had a cost. In a small, honest archive I teach a seminar now on provenance and marginalia. I show students images and point to the 3 strokes and the dot. I demonstrate how to read layers of accession marks and donor slips. I show them Lucius microfilm overlays and Anna's notes. They examine scans and trace the cipher across digital images. We talk about the trade-offs we made. I do not moralize. I point to the evidence and to the decisions. The university moved on as institutions do. New archives were gifted, committees reformed, and donors continued to endo chairs. People adjusted. But the practice we uncovered altered how a small network of scholars read footnotes. The illusion of a single, unbroken authority cracked. The idea that consensus in footnotes always equaled truth was no longer defensible in the same way. The last morning I spent at the isolated reading room, I folded the burnt bookmark into my satchel. I placed the satchel on the table, opened my brass pocket watch, and set it to the time I had first seen the damp ink ring. Then I closed the lamp and sat in the dark for a long minute. The leak that Lucia had sent began to trend that day, and within hours reposts and academic replies filled my inbox. My exile was not a punishment but a trade. Distance for the capacity to continue. I pushed the satchel under my coat, took the train ticket Lucia had arranged, and locked the reading room door behind me. The door made an ordinary click that connected the chapter end to a public record already moving towards scrutiny and correction.